laughs.
So when I think this was 2010, we're very lucky to have Steve as our first presenter. It's always hard to get someone to be the first cabinet range. He'll be talking about direct provision centres, which he'll explain to us. And then when he's finished, the format is he'll talk for about, 40 minutes?
40 minutes, yeah.
And then Kieran will act as discussion and respond to it, or comment on it, or extend it, or whatever Kieran feels like doing. And then we'll open it up for discussion. We've got a 2-hour slot, but we don't have to take up 2 hours. Early if we want that allowed. So we'll just see. Okay, Steve, go.
Yeah, thanks. Just have to make a qualification. I actually have a throat and ear infection, so when I speak, I hear an echo. I should have one of those cones, so when you ask questions, you'll have to shout a bit. So I'll speak quite slowly, and I was in bed for just a couple of days, so I didn't manage. I wanted to cut these down, this number of slides down, but I didn't manage to get round to it. But what I'm going to do is keep the slides, and I will skim through them because there's a few quotes that I'd like to use. Well, just a little bit of background. I was asked to do some research for a couple of NGOs one's called Integrating Ireland. They essentially wanted to, asylum seekers in Ireland, they're not allowed to work. And they wanted me to produce a sort of booklet which could be used to, if you like, lobby the government about trying to win the right for asylum seekers to work. Now that was possible in 2007 during the context the boom was still here. With the recession, I wrote the draft and it's not going to come out because basically they think it's pointless. There's no way in the world that they're going to give asylum seekers the right to work. But that's just a bit of the context. Now the Refugee Council, I was also involved with work with them. They were allowed more or less. There was a number of complaints from asylum seekers that the system for direct provision wasn't being monitored, and so the government essentially said to the Refugee Council, "Okay, you can travel to these direct provision centres and you can check the standards of the asylum seekers who live here. You can see what's happening." And essentially, all I did was I went on their coattails. So I would go in with them. They'd organise, put posters up around the direct provision centre. I would then go with them. They'd introduce me as Steve Doyle. If anyone wants to speak to him, you can go outside and you can have a chat, etc. And I carried out about 20 or so interviews. This was about 3 years ago, 2007. So it was a while ago. But I always remember that it wasn't a great experience. As I say, I'm on the policy board for the Migrant Rights Centre and the Immigrant Council of Ireland, 2 other NGOs. But the experience, so we deal with migrant workers coming in, their issues, etc. But this was it was every time I left the centre. It was one of the most depressing experiences. You just felt drained, and I could leave the centre at the end of the day, but most of these people had to stay in there. But what's interested me, this is a chapter from a book, is just looking at their sort of differential, different experience they've had from, say, migrant workers. People often talk about immigrants generally as a very broad category, but of course they're a very diverse group. But what was unusual in Ireland is asylum seeking, compared to most other European countries, asylum seeking preceded labour migration to an extent. 1990s, early 1990s. Nigerians were really the sort of first group, and they more or less framed the debate in which migration took place. So there was often talk about Nigerians coming here as bogus asylum seekers, and that really got replaced in 2004 with a different discourse which talks about displacement or replacement of indigenous workers by Polish workers, etc. And I was also looking at state distinctions. The state often categorises people. And rather than providing all individuals, humans with similar social and political rights, the state differentiates. The differentiation between asylum seekers and migrant workers, we use this as academics, but these are state categories. They want to differentiate between those who are prosecuted politically and those who are prosecuted economically. Again, this is it has its historical division emerges with capitalism and feudal societies. You don't have such a hard and fixed division. But what I want to say is that I was partly interested in looking at just how the state wants to categorise people, classify them and treat them in different ways. A colleague of Bourdieu's, Algerian sociologist called Abdul Malik Syed, once wrote, "The sociology of migration is an introduction to the sociology of the state." And to an extent, I would extend that. It's also an introduction to the sociology of power. So I don't want to give this sort of Manichaean view here that, state here's bad, here's asylum seekers, here's poor asylum seekers, as if there's some, binary category, look how horrible they are. What I'm trying to convey is just how power operates and how it manifests itself, rather than trying to give a sort of morally loaded account, which it is very prevalent in the migration discourse. It's a very emotive area as well. Okay, and to do that, I'm drawing on two writers, sociologists, Pierre Bourdieu and his early work on Algerian, particularly what he called the Algerian subproletariat. Again, it's writing that's not really covered with Bourdieu. People normally jump in on his stuff on habitus, fields, etc. This was his early stuff, and there's one or two essays I found really useful. Bourdieu's PhD was actually on the work of Husserl and a discussion of everyday temporality. And some of it's captured in his essays. Some of them are more dense than others, but I found it very useful. Again, Stephen will tell you, when I was first here, I used to teach theory, and Stephen's always saying that, when you're younger, you like theory, but as you get a bit older, you tend to despise it. And I think that's true. But I think I found the work here, it wasn't a case that, you say that this is what Bourdieu says, but the work is generative in the sense that you can use it, and it's fruitful for explaining these processes, and that's why I've used it. And Goffman, of course, with his work on asylum, and I'll come into that a bit later. Now, just looking at giving statistics, I've been a bit obsessed with numbers. I've cut most of these statistical tables out. But if you're looking at numbers, you can see just how quickly the number of asylum applications in Ireland rose. 1992, 39 applications. That's minuscule compared to any other country. But you see them rise very dramatically. They reached their peak in 2002, 11,634. But then they decline rapidly, and there's various reasons for that. Maybe in the discussion period we could go into that. And as of last year, the latest figures we have, they've fallen considerably. They've gone down to 2,689. So it happened very quickly. Again, Ireland was historically a country of emigration. Everyone knows that. 1996, the last country in the EU 15 to become a country of net immigration. All of a sudden, very quickly. And again, another interesting fact is that last September, for the first time again after 10, 15 years, it became a country of emigration again. There was more in that in the context of the recession. Okay, what about the direct provision system? Well, set up in November 1999 and formally put into operation in April 2000. It was introduced through a ministerial circular and therefore has no statutory basis. Now that's important because most things which are put through law, they have to be approved through equality legislation, stuff like that. So by a ministerial circular, you can do things that you couldn't if you were passing something through law. Prior to 2000, they basically got asylum seekers basically got supplementary welfare. And if they got private accommodation, they would be given rent for that, rent supplement. After 2000, the direct provision system was introduced, and now all asylum seekers were henceforth housed and dispersed in various accommodation centres across the country, and they were provided with 3 fixed meals a day. They're not allowed to supplementary welfare payments, but instead receive €19.10 per adult and €9.60 per child per week. That constitutes about 3% of the national average wage. Now, this amount was established in 2000 and remains unchanged despite inflation. As of the end of April 2009, I need to update, there are about 6,800 asylum seekers from 96 different nationalities dispersed in about 62 accommodations centres throughout the state. 58 of these were centres which gave you 3 meals a day, but there's also 8 self-catering centres in which people are given the ability to cook for themselves. And I'll say later how that's very important. We see it as a trivial thing. There's actually a very important aspect to that. Now, the majority are from Africa, in terms of continent, but in terms of nationality, Nigeria and Democratic Republic of Congo. The age profile is of a very young population, with just over about 50% between 18 and 35, and 30% age 17 or younger. So it's a generally very young population. Quite a few of them are in families, but there's also a number of single males and single females. It tends to be the case if there is a direct provision centre, they'll put most of the single males into certain centres, put single females in other centres, families in other centres. Since the system was put in place, about 49,000 asylum seekers have passed through it. Now, I got this, I was very pleased about getting this. I don't know how, it was a letter from Sean Aylward, who's head of Department of Justice, and we've got in a very obscure publication, but these are the figures of how long they've been in direct provision centres. As of 2008 or 2008. About 2,100 have been in there for less than a year, about 1,700 for between 1 and 2 years, 1,300 2 and 3 years, about 848 for 3 to 4 years, and 900, just under 1,000 for over 4 years. Now, the impulses underlying the creation of the DP system were complex. I think Kieran's going to talk about that, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. Again, it can come up in the discussion. But the Department of Justice argued that the large number of asylum seekers who arrived in the island in the last 3 months of 1999 stretched its economic and stretched its resources. So there was a sudden jump from 826 applications to 3,278. Now, the Eastern Health Board, which was responsible for allocating accommodation, also talked about the number of availability of limited availability of accommodation, and had to turn people away. However, notwithstanding the sharp increase in numbers and the accommodation shortage in Dublin, you also have to see it within a slightly broader context. Firstly, the state was very concerned about asylum seekers' numbers increasing and wanting to deter those numbers. But once they were here, a number of them were disappearing from the system. They didn't know where they were going. Okay? So it's about regulating populations, as sort of Foucauldian notion. Secondly, you can't understand the direct provision without understanding its introduction also in the UK. The common travel area between the UK and Ireland means that you can travel freely between the two countries without a passport. You just need a form of ID, and that's existed historically. But this means two things. Firstly, any immigration legislation passed in the UK is normally copied by Ireland. They're policing each other's borders, as they would say. Okay, so they tend to copy each other in terms of their policy and what they do. So, and this is why John O'Donoghue, the Minister of Justice, says, if my scheme for asylum seekers is more attractive than the British scheme, it must stand to any kind of logical reasoning that I would have a disproportionate number coming here from Britain. So in the UK, they introduced the direct provision scheme, and essentially they were given £35 in vouchers to be spent in designated shops. And for the Irish state, well, £35 was too much, so what the Irish state, they went even lower. They said they'd give 15 Irish euros in cash form to asylum seekers as a massive disincentive, okay? That was a figure that was given to people in long-term institutional care. So social welfare was cut dramatically. Now, this direct provision centre, however, also has a strong sort of again, the whole process of immigration is characterised by a democratic deficit, from every area. But there was very little discussion about the direct provision system. It was put in, and it was put in very quickly. So there was high levels of resentment from communities. You've had this with travellers before, but this was now with asylum seekers. Any area that found they were going to have asylum seekers coming to the area, there was a large number of protests. Ballsbridge, Donnybrook, Macroom, Rosslare. I think in Rosslare they burnt down the hotel where they were going. More recently in County Mayo, a new centre was abandoned, as the town's mayor noted. If you have 300 to 400 people that are put in a situation by the government that they're left with €9 a week, they have very little to do. These people are not going to spend their time on the balconies and on the banks of the river. It's not going to be something that will encourage people to come and fish here. I mean, tacitly he was also implying, asylum seekers also means black and Nigerians. But, other protests, they were very significant. As I say, I'm going to just draw on Bourdieu and Goffman, and the reason for that is I think these are theories with some utility. They help generate new empirical or explanatory relevant theories. Now, Bourdieu's work, his early work, was largely about this Algerian, what he called as an Algerian subproletariat, and Bourdieu looked at how during this policy of colonisation, Algeria more or less imposed a capitalist economy on what was very much a rural society. A country which was pervaded with agricultural working, how people saw their lives in terms of cycles and the seasons, how they would plant agriculture. All of a sudden you had the French impose a system of capitalism on them. Okay? And for Bourdieu this led to what he calls hysteresis, where people's sense of self-understanding, the way they related to the world, their relationship to the environment, the land, all of this became uprooted, led to high levels of social suffering. So a habitus which is developed in one social situation faces this big shock, becomes transformed. Elias also talks about this in his young workers study, this shift from moving from school to work. But this shift, but what they're trying to talk about here is this sense of dislocation. And for Bourdieu, this isn't just a psychological thing, but it affects the whole body within his framework. Goffman, similarly, in his work in sociology, particularly the work on asylums, wants to look at the assault, various factors which assault and violate the territory of the self and the marginal control that individuals have over it. The book Asylum is a very famous book. It was undertaken, his wife was actually interned in the asylum in which he was studying, so it was a very personal account for Goffman to go in there and to try to look at these processes. But what he's trying to look at is he's trying to look at the degradation and defilement of self-esteem caused by a fall into a lower social status. So what Goffman calls role dispossession, a sense of powerlessness and inefficacy. And central to this for Goffman is this, you no longer can carry out actions which constitute indicators of what you were as a person. You cannot do the things that you wanted to do or what you were used to doing. That kind of freedom and autonomy which you take for granted could no longer take place. And how does Goffman talk about total institutions? Well, he defines them as places in which a large number of like-situated individuals cut off from the wider society for an appreciable period of time together lead an enclosed, formally administered round of life. As he says later, total institutions are forcing houses for changing persons. Each is a natural experiment of what can be done to the self. So a total institution strips the individual of an otherwise recognised autonomy. They bureaucratically process individuals and strip them of their autonomy, dehumanise and degrade them, and corrode and destroy their sense of self-esteem, regulating, manipulating and constraining their behaviour. Now, Goffman has in mind asylums, prisons, but also boarding schools and army barracks. As I say, I wanted to try to extend this to looking at direct provision centres. And what I want to essentially say is that direct provision centres are also exclusionary forms of spatial and social closure. They separate asylum seekers from mainstream Irish society, dehumanise, degrade, and ultimately prevent their integration into Irish society. And what I do want to say, and I'm going to give more examples, concrete empirical examples, is essentially that these taken for granted social and spatial divisions between sleep and work and play are broken down. Human needs are organised so that nearly all aspects of the asylum seeker's life takes place under one roof. Again, this is Goffman's definition of asylums. Their daily activity is carried out in the company of a large group of others and brought together in a single rational plan designed to fulfil the aims of the institution. So I want to talk about how an asylum seekers, as soon as they enter the centre, they're immediately stripped of the social support that, and the social formal arrangements that they had in their previous existence, if you like, and how their territorial self becomes mortified, progressively stripped and assaulted. Now, this mortification process involves a number of features, a process of trimming and programming, in which the individual becomes coded into an object that can be worked on by the machinery of the centre. And these processes had already been initiated with the individuals entering the state and their registration as an asylum seeker. If you have to claim for asylum, you have to go to a Garda National Immigration Bureau, or you go to Department of Justice, then you then fill in forms, but you're actually formalised in a very complex bureaucratic process. And this is similar with asylum seekers. They enter the centre, they have their own files, which only the certain people of staff have access to all their information. Again, Goffman highlights this in a much more elaborate degree in his book. Now, one of the areas I want to look at is just and its implications is work. Now, unlike nearly all other European countries where asylum seekers are permitted to work after a certain period, Ireland, together with Denmark, denies them this right, forcing them to be idle and unemployed. So both the Netherlands and Switzerland, after 6 months, are allowed. Austria, Greece and Finland allow asylum seekers to work after 3 months, but Ireland is the only country that doesn't allow with Denmark doesn't allow. I think in the UK it's 12 months. It's the only country that doesn't allow them to work at all. Now, I think work has 4 main functions, probably provides more than that, but just in terms of my own research. It provides, firstly, a social context to meet people and aid integration. However, rather than going to work and meeting people, asylum seekers remain trapped and often in remotely situated DP centres. And their misery and insecurities are compounded by the loss of group ties on which their psychological and social stability was based prior to arriving in Ireland. As one asylum seeker described the situation, she felt very, very lonely. While those in families have to face new tensions induced by their stressful and inhospitable conditions, their virtual confinement to the centre means that relations within families become heavily strained, with the pressures of living and having to spend all of one's time with the same people. As again, another one, I've been here 3 years and 1 month and never go out. Christmas, Easter, everything here, this place, nothing else. Nowhere else. Nowhere else. So trying to maintain the family and the children's expectations. For example, when I was interviewing males, they had the sense that they could no longer, albeit it's a patriarchal view, they could no longer provide for their children. They can no longer bring them food, and the children look at them as if they're failures, and they internalise that sense that they feel from their family. What I do need to say, and I'll probably say this later, is that conditions vary very broadly between centres, and I will come on to that later. Secondly, work provides a sense of identity and social status. So being unable to work not only results in what Goffman calls role dispossession, but it also disrupts a differentiated role schedule they had prior to coming to into the direct provision centre. So Goffman talks about how we have all these different roles. Other sociologists use more complex terms. Bhaskar talks about position practices, but they mean more or less the same thing as social roles. But for example, one asylum seeker talks about how most of the time they do very little. They just eat, sleep, and watch TV. They no longer have this fluidity between different roles, which are different modes of identification for most people living in society more broadly. But instead, they become frozen by the surrounding treatment. They're not only categorised, but they're treated as asylum seekers, which becomes more or less their dominant identity. And simultaneously, it's a stigmatised identity, which again, because of the power relations, they tend to internalise. Now, even prior to the asylum seekers entry to the DP centre, they had already been very negatively framed. So, there was a lot of media discourses, but also politicians were talking about them as bogus, coming here as sponges, sponging of the system. They were always in a paradox. They weren't allowed to work, so they had to claim welfare. So they were seen as sponges. But And asylum seekers always had a lack of power to challenge these. You know, if the news of the world writes about them as being spongers or rapists or involved in crime, they don't have any sort of counter way of challenging that. You know, they don't have their own newspapers. They don't have any form of counter information. So, but what is interesting is the way they do become caught in this frame trap, in which they become framed in a certain way or spoken in a certain way, and all further information is used to more or less consolidate that way that they're framed. And within this negative social status, they now have to, again, this is Goffman's discussion of asylum, they now have to see themselves within how they're socially defined as others, but yet at the same time they feel slightly distant from it. You know, it's something that's how Goffman talks about taking a identifying role of the stigmatized and degraded individual. You know, they have a new conception of their self which is being imposed on them, which they do not want to accept, but is socially because of differential power relations, imposed on them. So, now the majority of them work. Most surveys show about 99% of them actually in one survey said they wanted to work. But instead they spend most of their lives dwelling on their situation, which leads to depression and insomnia. Again, as one noted, every day you're doing the same thing. You have no education, no sport, something to do. You've nowhere to go. I don't know. You get depression, you get very upset all day watching TV, you know, it's not good. I tried to ask last year for permission to work, but you never get it. And I drink, you know, because that €19 a week, I drink that. Without drink, I cannot sleep. Or with tablets, I'm taking sleeping tablets. So he was talking about, you know, the pressure. On the one hand, he had €19, and his wife wanted him to, you know, try to spend that on him and his family. But on the other hand, he was talking about how he just spent it in the pub and the sort of conflict that caused in the family. Many also take up drinking and smoking as a result of boredom. There are also high levels of insomnia. I'll mention this later on. You know, most of the medical opinion says that there's very high numbers suffer from depression. Work also provides a source of income and finance. But its legal prohibition means that asylum seekers are forced into fairly acute poverty. Now, the extremely low weekly subsistence allowance means that asylum seekers no longer afford to even buy small items. You know, things like phone cards to keep in contact with relatives who are living abroad, nor can they, some of them are in very remote centres. Now, occasionally some of the centres have buses which go into town and come back, but there's one centre, and there's only one bus that goes all day, and it's not provided by the centre, it's actually a bus you have to pay, and it's like, you know, €2, and that's seen as it's a lot of money if you have €19 a week. But so many of them feel, you know, basic things, actions they want to participate in and do. They also find it difficult to buy toiletries and cosmetics, products which allow them to exert some control over their presentation before others. Though some are given a one-off clothing allowance by the welfare officer at their discretion, this is not guaranteed, and again it shows this relationship of dependency and a loss of autonomy. There's an inability to buy clothing, cosmetics. Again, they're sort of stripped of what Goffman calls identity equipment, used to present the self to others, how the self should appear. Again, stripped of these inadequate financial resources, they become obliged to ask for minor supplies. And again, they see this asking for things constantly. You know, they take on the childlike role. Can I have this? Can you do that? Can I get this? So, for example, in one centre without laundry facilities, they're only allowed to hand in one item of clothing to be washed a week. In another, they're only given one toilet roll a week. So these, again, you know, basic things are dehumanising and show a sense of dependency. This new submissive role results in a feeling of demoted to a suppliant childlike status, especially when the request for small items one feels one is entitled to is consistently refused. You know, just one guy talking about how he could never get a pillow and sheets. Now, work also provides a sense of purpose and meaning and a minimum security in order to have assurance about the present and to be able to plan and construct a future. And this is what I'm sort of more or less bringing in Bourdieu's early work on the shift in temporal horizons of the Algerian subproletariat. Many of them were pushed off the land and expected to find work in the capitalist economy. But most of them didn't have a clue. There were no jobs on the one hand, but most of them didn't really know how you went about doing this. Or, the structures weren't in place, nor was the habitus. Bourdieu says the whole of their existence was lacking that which normally constitutes its main framework. The daily work at one's customary occupation with its temporal and spatial rhythms, the demands it imposes, the security it offers, the future that it allows one to envisage and plan for, they inevitably become reconciled and accustomed to a parasitic vegetative form of existence. So this, what Bourdieu talks about the Algerian subproletariat, I think could be applied quite easily to asylum seekers. And as I said, there's a shift in their whole temporal horizon. What do I want to talk about here? Heidegger's idea that we're futural beings, that we look to the future, those who don't are inauthentic. Well, asylum seekers constitute the most inauthentic people. They constitute as what Heidegger would call the they. But I also, I want to skip this, but most of Merleau-Ponty's argument that in order to have a notion of future, in order to look to the future, you need to have a healthy body as well in order to engage in projects. I found that interesting, particularly because most of them were suffering from depression or ill health, etc. So I'm just going to go into Bourdieu's discussion on time and power. And in his discussion of the Algerian subproletariat, he has a very, very nice quote I always liked. An old Kabyle once said that the French act as if they would never die. I love that sense of power, that they come in, this is their world, etc., etc. And they can do what they want in the world, and they can live forever, that kind of thing. And Bourdieu goes on to say, nothing is more foreign to the indigenous civilization of Algeria, this is particularly those who are unemployed, than the attempt to secure a hold over the future. And nothing more strange to it than the idea of an immense and open future as a broad field of innumerable possibilities, which man is able to explore and dominate. So time can only be defined relationally, people like Durkheim pointed this out, but also Eliason is discussing timing. But so that time for work only has meaning by being negatively defined against time for leisure. Without work as a signpost or measure, the day loses its rhythm, and in some ways time stops. Again, using just Bourdieu, when we speak of underemployment, it means simply that what happens is not what we expected. Unlike time of others in society, their time is valueless. The nature and the number of events that we keep to constitute time sequences, hence their tempo, depends on the principle of selection that we, time sequence, hence the tempo depend on the principle of selection that we use implicitly, and that underlies the ideas we have about work and therefore about life itself. So aware that they cannot work, this idea of time contrasted to full-time, time that you work, wasted time, all this only makes sense in relation to working. So some talk about their experience of duration, particularly the asylum seekers I did speak to, as empty, homogeneous, wasted time involving basic activities. What do we do here? We have nothing to do. Just watch TV, eat and sleep. That's what's killing us. So time is perceived as time which has been stolen from their lives. Given that over 50% are between 18 and 35, they often see as time which they've really wasted, something that they should have really been doing during that period of their lives. Every day what I'm going to as one said about how he felt institutionalized, he'd been there for 3 years. Every day, what am I going to think after 3 years if they give me a bad decision, i.e. if they refuse him refugee status? I'll use 3 years for nothing. How do I explain my youth when I was 26 when I arrived, in this country? I'm 29 now. For 3 years I've been idle. For me now, even to work it's difficult because I'm lazy now. I've been sitting for 3 years, sleeping, sitting, eating. So instead of basically perceiving the future as a world of open possibilities, which can be realised through rational action, asylum seekers remain locked in the present. enclosed with an obsession with the morrow and a fascination with the immediate. Time in some ways has stopped for them. All they do is they think about when are they going to get their decision. They're constantly phoning the lawyers, saying, is there been a decision? The lawyers get annoyed because they keep getting these phone calls and they say, no, nothing's changed, there's nothing I can do. The asylum seekers blame the lawyers, and the lawyers say, well, what do they expect me to do? So it's a situation in which nobody is particularly happy. Just quoting one of the guys again. When I think of my future, I have nothing in my hands, nothing. I have nothing, there's no future for me. You get cancer, you get sick, you smoke thinking makes your sugar level go up, he had diabetes. I'm getting fat, sleeping, getting up, thinking. I'm a human being, human beings cannot keep for long. Now, I just wanted to say, the accommodation, sorry, I've only got 5 or so minutes, so I'm just going to be very quick on this. The accommodation for asylum seekers varies markedly. Those who are living in families can often live in cramped conditions. They have families who live with other families. One family who I interviewed, they were in a house with 4 or 5 bedrooms, which accommodated 14 individuals, including 9 children. There was no living room to share, just a shared kitchen. And the parents found it difficult to sleep with the children, and the children were unable to study because of constant noise. There was also, they were talked about how they couldn't study because they were kept up by the other family's children. But there was also resentment between the families. And inter-ethnic xenophobia or discrimination is it's not discussed very much, but it's apparent. So someone would be someone from Afghanistan, for example, would be complaining about the Nigerians and the food they cooked. I have to share a kitchen with this guy, and the food they cook smells. I don't like the smell of it. All these there was very high tensions. Okay, in other centres which cater predominantly for singles rather than families, 4 single men sharing a room. In Viking House, for example, 90% shared a room with at least 3 others, largely bunk beds. Again, there's high levels of resentment between roommates. Some want to stay up, some have insomnia, so they want to watch television late at night. That keeps the other ones up. Again, again, there's high levels of tension between roommates. And again, this sense of personal autonomy, about having your own personal space that Goffman talks about. This invasion of the South has been challenged, it's been contaminated by things or people that one does not like. And that boundary and your environment has become challenged. In terms of relating to staff, the staff there tends to be a split between the staff and the asylum seekers. The staff, when you speak to them, they see asylum seekers as too demanding, very instrumental, self-seeking and spoiled. They should be lucky they're here anyway, what do they expect? In contrast, asylum seekers see staff as condescending, unsympathetic, mean-spirited, especially when they don't give them what they want. And just one thing here, there is a sense that the staff have more power than they do. Asylum seekers there's a strong hierarchy in terms of the direct provision centres. There's one direct provision centre called Mosney, which used to be a holiday home in Ireland, and nearly all it's a self-catering centre, and nearly all the asylum seekers want to be sent there because you have your own food, you're near a city, it's all very convenient, and so they constantly have this sense that the staff there can help or facilitate that. And the staff in turn, even though they can't do that, use that as a way to control them. If you cause any more trouble, if you don't come back and sign in tonight, you're not going to be transferred, or you'll be transferred to a worse centre. And again, it sort of leads to this childlike supplicant relationship. Yeah, this is just carrying on. I mean, Mosney is the best centre. One in Athlone, speaking to quite a few asylum seekers. There's one in Athlone which is just in caravans and no heating, nothing. It's seen as the worst. And this guy, he was telling me about Athlone. I lived in Athlone nearly 2 years, accommodation caravans. I fought there and got transferred. I tried to get into Mosney. We fought each other. He was not even here 2 years, but he got a plus for reporting people to social welfare. He got sent to Dundalk. Dundalk is self-catering. You get your own bedroom, you get good light. So this was a guy, he had a fight with a guy who he felt had grasped on him for claiming social welfare illegally in order to get better accommodation. Now, I'm just going to finish up very briefly by talking about I wanted to say something about the food, but I'm going to skip that. Essentially, there's a very strong sense of anger which relates to food. They have 3 fixed meals a day. And again, the meals become increasing. And when asylum seekers, they didn't complain so much about things that you thought they would have. The thing that most of them complain about is the food. They're sick of the food. They get rice with chips, fish fingers. It's a basic thing you get every day, and it's on a repetitive basis. Now, asylum centres are meant to change the diet in order to cater for different national needs, but there's something like 96 different nationalities. They're not going to do that. It costs them money. Direct provision centres in the country, they don't access Asian shops, etc., to get those ingredients. It's just not going to happen. So there's a very strong sense of resentment, particularly, with pregnant women as well. But as a result of it, the food, people either eat all this processed food, in which case they've gained high levels of weight, or other people, because they just can't face rice again or chips again, there's massive weight loss. So you get one of the 2 extremes. Again, mental health, just to mention that briefly, most reports have said that it's pretty bad. The Irish Medical Association recently, 90% of asylum seekers suffer from depression after spending 6 months in the state. Asylum seekers 5 times more likely than an Irish citizen to be diagnosed with a psychiatric illness. Now, I'm just going to finish on this. Now, although Bourdieu and Goffman did look at the effects of this uprooting and total institutions, they looked at the social and psychological effects, but they wanted it in the cultural aspects, but they always wanted to maintain that you have to understand these within sort of broader economic contexts. Bourdieu was very explicit talking about the whole capitalist economy and how it was imposed. But Goffman also acknowledges the role of expenditure and how direct provision, and how total institutions operate. As he says, the various rationales for mortifying the self are merely rationalisations generated by efforts to manage the daily activity of a large number of persons in a restricted space with a small expenditure of resources. Now, the Irish state has, for various reasons, decided not to fund these centres themselves or pay for the centres, but actually to hire them out to private companies. Since 2001 to 2007, with the exception of 2006, the cost of direct provision has been 83 million a year. So this means that the state has paid out over €500 million on direct provision centres. In fact, it could have, and maybe we'll talk about this in the thing, it would have not cost them so much to allow asylum seekers to work and find their own accommodation. Moreover, a small number of contractors run multiple accommodation centres. In 2005, for example, 8 companies ran over the 50% of the centres, and the 3 of the largest companies operate a large number of all the centres. They earn 37 million between them. East Coast Catering, Mill Street, and Bridgestock, they're the 3 big ones. One company itself made over 13 million for one centre alone. Balseskin, which is a reception centre. And again, Bridgestock increased its profits before tax by over 600% on an annual turnover of 6.1 million. Now, in order to cater for these asylum seekers, there's pressure by the Department of Justice to reduce costs. And this, again, I was pleased to get this letter from Jim O'Keefe. And the costs have been reduced from €38.60 per person a day in 2000 to €28.35 in 2006. As the Reception and Integration Agency proudly noted in a letter to Jim O'Keefe, these reductions in price were achieved against a backdrop of significant increases in operation costs, as well as increased contractual obligations imposed by the Reception and Integration Agency and inflation. So even though in the past 6 years they've managed to cut these costs, and this is obviously at the expense of the treatment of asylum seekers. So just to finish, well, how do we look at the Irish state? Well, we have to firstly look at asylum seekers as a fairly powerless group. They lack the power to voice their concerns. Unlike labour migrants, they don't have the power to withdraw their labour, since that's not given to them in the first place. And as a result, they've also been excluded. The Minister of Integration we have in Ireland, he doesn't deal with asylum seekers. They're seen as in class by imposition. And in this current conjuncture, it's become a commonplace. It's become something that's taken for granted. So there's a new Immigration, Residence and Protection Bill in the Dáil at the moment, and despite something like 700 amendments, not one of them talks about improving the situation of asylum seekers in terms of direct provisions. Rather, it's more about increasing powers of deportation. Whenever I show this paper, people say, well, what about the agency? Asylum seekers aren't just these passive effects. Yeah, I'm not saying all of them are. I'm just talking about the ones, the number I spoke to formally and informally. But there does seem to be a sense that, people often point to James Scott's work or de Certeau's work on how you always have resistance to power. But these people are highly disempowered. And Bourdieu's work in Algeria, just to add to that, Bourdieu was trying to challenge Fanon's work. Fanon had talked about the wretched of the earth, how they were oppressed and how they were going to rise from this oppression to challenge the French authorities. Now, Bourdieu thought that was politically dangerous. He wanted to show that a lot of people in Algeria, some do rise and challenge the situation, but a number of them don't. A number of them just fall back into alienation, a sense of resignation and powerlessness. And I think that sort of characterises a number of the groups in the asylum seekers, the number of asylum seekers in direct provision in Ireland. Well, there have been hunger strikes. There have been, again, the occupation of St Patrick's Cathedral, hunger strike in Limerick as well in 2008, and groups have been forming. But generally, when you're talking about the majority, there is a sense of powerlessness and a very bleak relationship to the future. All right. So on that slightly negative note, I'll finish. Thanks.
Okay. We've all got questions, but we'll go to Kieran first to respond. Steve, can you give him the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. There's not a lot I can add to the detail of what Steve has described. I'm going to sit down. I think that I think what Steve is doing is a very good example of a type of sociology I like, which is very detailed description of often quite small aspects of life, which I think probably it is style of people like Vacan, but also inspired by a deeply theoretical understanding. And in this case, I think the big emphasis has been on the categories of the state and how categories of the state are not just intellectual categories, but in fact form people and indeed form their lives. And I think what emerges from it is a profound shock to anybody who has the Whig view of history. In other words, that history is a story of human progress to a more liberal and tolerant world. Because, what has just been described is we have 7,000 people who are effectively in an open prison, living on €19 a week, which hasn't changed since 2000. Maybe just to, I don't normally do this, but just maybe, because we've talked a lot of the detail, just to give a personal example, a friend of mine, Abdul, we'll use his name, came from Ethiopia. He was a part-time lecturer, like some of us here. He was a member of an NGO, and he was invited by the Irish government, as part of its reach out to Africa policies, to discuss civil society in Ethiopia. Probably not known to the Irish government, he had suffered a police beating, he had suffered interrogation, torture in the police station, and having come to the West, he decided to apply for asylum. He's still sitting in a hostel somewhere in Kerry for the last, I think, 3-4 years now. Whenever he visits me, we have the Cinderella rule, which is that he has to be back within 48 hours. I think it's an extraordinary life. And you think the 7,000 people in this situation, 7,000 people who have mobile phones, drink Guinness, dress the same as everybody else. So we can't say we're in a feudal society, we don't quite understand they're human beings, but that's more or less what the society we have. So the question is, how, given a Whig view of history, where Western society is about progress to greater liberalism, how could this possibly happen? And the only thing I can really add to Steve's thing is just to add a slight historical perspective. Okay, the word asylum is interesting, right? Because it originally has a religious connotation. It is the idea of fleeing to a sanctuary. It's, if you like, comes from that great split in Western civilization between the power of the church and the power of the state. And you could, at certain points, flee to the church, get on a particular chair, claim asylum. I think you had about 40 days. And then you had to either leave the country or confess to your sins. And this is recognized, if you like, as an article of the church from around, I think around 500. Now, that simple concept that you can flee to a part that is not surrounded by secular power has an immensely progressive effect. One theory, not by one minor theory probably, of the formation of cities in Western Europe as against, for example, Asia, is that the protection the church offers, for example, having sanctuary crosses in a particular area, was often the basis of traders in caravans, forming caravans, and so on. So one point I'm saying is, asylum sanctuary has created a space for, if you like, development of certain aspects of Western civilization. And that was the past, and you would expect, therefore, according to the Whig view of history, then we should probably be progressing on that. In fact, we're going the opposite way. I mean, asylum as a process, I mean, first of all, we should say there are many famous asylum seekers. We should note Descartes was an asylum seeker, Hobbes is an asylum seeker, Karl Marx was an asylum seeker. But broadly speaking, you know, it exists as a major concept in the 19th century of political refugees, particularly Irish Fenians, for example, enjoyed a status as asylum seeker. But just the one thing I want to add, really, just an insight from the, I think, a great book, John Torpey, The Invention of the Passport. I mean, it all comes down to the passport, really, doesn't it? It comes down to that wonderful little document we have called the passport, and that how that categorizes you. And I mean, when you look back at history, you find that the passport was originally a document to regulate the movement of people within countries. It's a document to ensure, for example, that wealthy people will not have to pay poor relief in a certain district. So you want to regulate their passage by a passport. So one of the, in the French Revolution, one of the cahiers, one of the grievances that cropped up a number of times was abolishing the passport, because you wanted to move around. You wanted to be able to move into Paris, move from a peasant life to a city life. And what you find, if you like, when you look at it in the broader sweep, that institutions, such as, for example, the positive institution of looking for asylum, or, if you like, the slightly more dubious one of passports, both of them have moved in quite different directions in the 20th century. The passport has been restored to an immensely powerful document in the 20th century it never occupied in any other previous period of existence. Extraordinary power the passport gives you. When we look at the question of asylum, we find that in the 1950s, the concept has its heyday. It has its heyday in terms of the conflict, the Cold War. The West, of course, defends asylum. You don't, if you like, go the other side of the Berlin Wall, you come this side of the Berlin Wall and you get asylum. And therefore, the concept of asylum is enshrined in various UN conventions, 1951 onwards. And really, if you look at the last 10, 20 years, it's perfectly obvious that far from, if you like, these historical concepts being venerated, developed, and expanded, in fact, it's the opposite, right? And the question of asylum, I mean, Steve's description of asylum in Ireland is not particular. I mean, obviously there's a lot of detail and so on, but the same thing is happening in Australia, it's happening in the Debré law in France, and so on. So the question is why that is. And I just want to really just finish on two brief points. Well, first of all, I think it raises questions about the humanitarianism of the West, right? Because asylum is linked to humanitarianism, to a humanitarian culture, but it would appear, when you examine the broad sweep of it, that humanitarianism is deployed in various ways. I mean, without going into the question of Haiti, but it's interesting how humanitarianism emerges in Haiti with security and so on. And similarly, in terms of asylum, humanitarianism emerges at particular moments that we offer asylum from dictatorships and communist tyrannies and so on, but it plays less of a role in modern society. So there's a question about how humanitarianism is deployed in Western society. And the last point really is that the basis of it surely is that asylum is a problem, because I mean, why would you keep people on €19 a week for nearly 10 years now? Because it's a disincentive, obviously, as Steve explained. If it's £35 in Britain and £15 in Ireland, that's an economic disincentive. It's a disincentive to these people. So by definition, asylum seekers are a problem. Why are they a problem? Because we have a world whereby, I don't think many of the Irish people who fled the famine went to Molesworth Street, first of all, to collect their passport and then went to America, whereas at the moment, it is the case that in order to move to any part of the world, you have to have this marvellous document called a passport. And if the passport is so important, and if there are so many laws and so on, then people are forced to look at the possibility of considering themselves political as against economic. And I think that the great strength of Steve's argument is that's a category. These are categories you're imposing on people. People aren't, I'm just political as against I'm economic, or I'm economic as against just political. People are forced into these categories by deep structures of the state, and also, I might argue, a global economy that's destroying parts of the world while, in terms of this process of urbanisation, and it therefore forces people into a particular category called political migrants, and then plays a double click on them by saying, oh, but you're bogus, because you're not really a political migrant, and we're going to put so many, if you like, obstacles in your way. So, yeah, the world without borders, I think, is probably a better way of doing things. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Q. That's great. So, Dave's outline how to do his work and hearing about a whole range of things. We can open it up for a question or an observation. Stephen, anyone?